May 18, 1940. Northern France. Through the crackling static of a Wehrmacht field radio, a German officer's voice breaks with something unfamiliar to the invincible Nazi war machine. Panic. Verdun fortress to headquarters, he transmits back to command. We are being slaughtered by black devils who fight like demons and take no prisoners. 4 weeks, Adolf Hitler's propaganda had promised his soldiers swift victory over France. His racial ideology had declared the superiority of the Aryan race. His generals had assured the troops they would face little resistance. But standing between the Wehrmacht and Paris were men the Führer had never prepared them for. Men whose very existence contradicted everything Nazi ideology claimed to be true. This is the story of 7 soldiers, 7 black men from the colonial territories of French West Africa who stood against Hitler's Blitzkrieg with a ferocity that would become legend. Their names were buried, their sacrifices erased, their courage written out of history because it was too dangerous to remember. For 70 years the world forgot them. But their story demands to be told. The colonial contradiction. The French colonial empire had built its wealth on a foundation of exploitation and lies. For centuries, European powers had justified their brutal occupation of Africa with a single narrative, that black people were inferior, incapable of civilization, unfit for equality. Yet when war came, these same powers turned to Africa, not for resources alone but for warriors. France had been recruiting African soldiers since the 1850s, creating units called the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, named after Senegal but drawn from across French West and Central Africa. By World War I, over 200,000 African soldiers had fought in European trenches. Thousands died at Verdun and the Somme. They were promised citizenship, equality, fair compensation for their sacrifice. Instead, they received segregation, lower pay, and systematic erasure from the victory they had helped secure. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, France once again called upon its colonies. This time, 340,000 African soldiers would answer. They were given the most dangerous positions on the front lines. They received inferior equipment and faced constant racism from the very army they served. French command viewed them as expendable shock troops. Nazi intelligence dismissed them as primitive savages who would flee at the first sign of real combat. Both nations would learn how catastrophically wrong they were. Captain Charles Nkora. Captain Charles Nkora from Gabon was a rarity in the colonial French army, a black career officer who had earned his rank through distinguished service in World War I. In May 1940, he commanded a defensive position near the town of Airaines, directly in the path of the German advance. When the Blitzkrieg hit his sector, Nkora and his men held their ground for 3 brutal days, inflicting casualties that shocked German commanders. The Nazi troops had been told these African soldiers would scatter at the first artillery barrage. Instead, they fought with disciplined ferocity, refusing to yield a single meter of French soil. When Nkora's position was finally overrun and he was captured, a German officer demanded he reveal French defensive positions. Nkora looked his captor in the eye and spoke words that would cost him his life. "I am a French officer. I will tell you nothing." The German officer, enraged that a black man would dare defy him, personally executed Nkora and several of his men. His death became a symbol of something the colonial powers had tried to suppress, that dignity and courage knew no color. Sergeant Major Addi Ba. Sergeant Major Addi Ba from Senegal earned the nickname the Lion during the chaotic French retreat. When his unit was ambushed and surrounded by German forces, Ba did the unthinkable. Rather than surrender, he led a counterattack so fierce that the Wehrmacht troops temporarily withdrew, stunned by the aggression. His men fought with the desperation of those who knew surrender might mean massacre. Eventually captured after his ammunition ran dry, Ba was imprisoned in a German POW camp where his resistance continued. He organized fellow prisoners, smuggled messages to resistance networks, and defied every attempt by Nazi guards to break his spirit. Ba survived the war and returned to Senegal in 1945, expecting the honor and recognition France had promised. Instead, he received nothing. No medals, no pension, no acknowledgement of his courage. He died decades later in poverty, his name unknown to the nation he had bled for. Corporal Blaise Diagne Jr. Corporal Blaise Diagne Jr. carried the weight of legacy into battle. His father, Blaise Diagne, had been the first black African elected to the French Parliament, a symbol of what colonial subjects might achieve. The younger Diagne fought to honor that legacy at a strategic bridge that German panzers needed to advance. For 48 hours, Diagne held against overwhelming odds, buying precious time for French forces to regroup. German battle reports described his defense with a phrase rarely used about enemy combatants: suicidal courage. When the position was finally overrun by sheer force of numbers, Diagon fought hand-to-hand until the end. His body was found still clutching his empty rifle, surrounded by spent shell casings. His father would spend years demanding France honor the African sacrifices. His pleas were largely ignored. Lieutenant Abdoulaye Ndiaye. Lieutenant Abdoulaye Ndiaye represented another inconvenient truth for the colonial system. Educated, fluent in multiple languages including German, he was a natural leader whose tactical brilliance saved an entire regiment from encirclement during the Battle of the Somme. His superiors praised his performance in combat reports while simultaneously denying him the basic respect afforded to white officers of equal rank. When Ndiaye requested the same accommodations given to his French counterparts, he was told to know his place. The colonial army would accept his excellence on the battlefield, but not his equality off it. Ndiaye continued fighting despite the humiliation. His strategic innovations were studied after the war but never properly credited to him. Private Mbap Sanger. Private Mbap Sanger became a ghost story among German troops. A natural marksman with preternatural calm, Sanger operated as an elite sniper with 37 confirmed kills in the first weeks of combat. He targeted German officers from distances that seemed impossible, creating chaos in Wehrmacht command structures. Soldiers began calling him Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. Units refused to advance through sectors where Sanger was rumored to be operating. The Nazis placed a bounty on his head, but he remained invisible, deadly, unstoppable. When France finally collapsed in June 1940, Sanger was captured while covering his unit's retreat. SS troops recognized him immediately and executed him in retaliation for the officers he had killed. French military records would deny his existence for decades. His story was only confirmed recently through German archives that meticulously documented their fear of him. Sergeant Yacouba Sylla. Sergeant Yacouba Sylla from Mali made his stand at Château-Thierry with just 14 men against a German company of 120 soldiers. For 24 hours they held an impossible position, inflicting over 40 casualties on the attackers. When German forces finally breached the defensive line, they found Sylla still alive despite being wounded 7 times, still fighting with a combat knife. A Wehrmacht officer, so moved by Sylla's courage, had German medics treat his wounds and later wrote in a letter home, "We had been told these Africans were cowards and savages. This man was the bravest soldier I have ever faced." Sylla survived as a prisoner of war and returned to Mali after liberation. Decades later, France awarded him a minor medal in a quiet ceremony that few noticed. Corporal Amadou Tall. Corporal Amadou Tall from Guinea survived the invasion and chose resistance over surrender. For 4 years he operated in the shadows of occupied France, sabotaging German operations, smuggling Allied pilots to safety, and coordinating attacks on Nazi installations. The Germans never realized one of their most effective adversaries was an African colonial soldier operating under various aliases, trusted by resistance leaders, saving countless lives through his invisible war. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, Tall expected recognition for his service. Instead, French authorities attempted to deny his service record entirely, claiming that a black man could not have been that effective in the resistance. Tall spent 40 years fighting to prove what he had done, finally receiving official recognition in the 1980s, shortly before his death at age 72. His story raises a haunting question. How many others were erased completely? The massacres they buried. But the courage of these men came at a terrible price that history tried to bury. Between May and June 1940, as France collapsed, German forces committed systematic massacres of African prisoners of war. At least 3,000 surrendered African soldiers were executed, not in combat but after laying down their arms. They were lined up and shot in fields, burned alive in barns, bayoneted in groups. German soldiers wrote letters home describing the killings. Officers justified the murders by claiming these Africans had fought with the savagery of beasts, and therefore deserved no protection under the rules of war. The truth was precisely the opposite. These men had fought with extraordinary discipline and courage, and they were murdered because Nazi racial ideology could not tolerate their excellence. For 70 years, both France and Germany suppressed this history. The massacres were omitted from textbooks and official memorials. Families were never told how their loved ones actually died. The betrayal continued. The betrayal continued even after victory. When Allied forces liberated France in 1944, African soldiers who had fought for 4 years expected to march as liberators. Instead, French command issued orders to whiten the liberation forces. Black soldiers were moved to the rear. White soldiers, many who had seen little combat, were placed at the front for the cameras and newsreels. The African troops who had bled for France were literally erased from the photographs of liberation. Then came the final insult: pensions. France had promised equal compensation for all veterans. But in 1959, as African nations gained independence from colonial rule, France froze the pensions of African veterans, claiming it no longer owed anything to soldiers from independent countries. White French veterans continued receiving full pensions for life. African veterans received nothing. Men who had saved France died in poverty while the nation they defended prospered. It was not until 2010, 70 years after these men had fought, that France finally equalized veteran pensions. By then, nearly all the African veterans were dead. Fewer than 30 survived to see this meager justice, all in their 90s and hundreds. Remember their names. In 2020, France erected a monument to the Tirailleurs Sénégalais in Paris, 80 years overdue. Dignitaries made speeches about honor and remembrance while carefully avoiding the question of why it had taken so long. These 7 soldiers, and the hundreds of thousands like them, were systematically erased from history because their courage contradicted the racist narrative that Europe needed to maintain. They were not supposed to be heroes. They were not supposed to be brilliant tacticians, fearless warriors, or men of unbreakable dignity. Their excellence threatened the entire justification for colonial oppression. So their names were forgotten. Their service records lost. Their sacrifices dismissed. Captain Charles Nkora, Sergeant Major Addi, Corporal Blaise Diagne Jr., Lieutenant Abdoulaye Ndiaye, Private Mbap Sanger, Sergeant Yakuba Silla, Corporal Amadou Tall. These men terrified Hitler's troops not with savagery but with skill, not with barbarism but with honor. They deserve more than silence. They deserve the truth. And their story demands that we ask, what other chapters of history have been erased? What other heroes have been forgotten? And what truths do we still refuse to see?